Welcome to Danielle Smith's Fraser Forum. This program is part of a series of podcasts doing in-depth interviews on free enterprise and personal liberty. I'm your host, Danielle Smith, president of the Alberta Enterprise Group. Go to fraserforum.org where you can subscribe, comment on the program, and see links to the studies we discuss. You will also find archives of previous episodes. Our email address is danielle@fraserforum.org. We'd love to hear from you.
The idea that now leisure is so cheap, while we're also incredibly more productive, the two are being somewhat tied together. You know what? It's so cheap to enjoy now because we're so productive. Video gaming tournaments are even the best illustration. There is people who invest in the leisurely act of competing in video game tournaments. That is the illustration of such great productivity that we can enjoy so much leisure that in effect, we are actually right now working the equivalent of 4 days a week.
Hello, welcome to another edition of Danielle Smith's Fraser Forum. I'm delighted today to be speaking with Vincent Geloso. He is a professor of economics at George Mason University and as well a senior fellow at the Fraser Institute. Vincent, thank you so much for being with me today.
It's a pleasure, Danielle.
So we're going to talk a lot about daycare. We're going to talk a bit about competition. We're going to, if we have the time, talk about a 4-day work week. But I wanted to start off talking with you about the nature of work and the nature of sort of this work-leisure trade-off, because I think a lot of times we get into discussing policy solutions, but I'm interested in knowing what policy problems we're trying to address with those solutions. So do we have a problem with work effort? Do we need to have government creating policies to poke people to get into the workplace? What is this work-leisure trade-off all about? What does the empirical data show?
So while every person is different in where they would have the tipping point I'm about to describe, everyone has that tipping point. The idea being that when we decide to work, what we are forsaking is free time. But when we take free time, what we are forsaking, because there's a mirror to this, is that we are forsaking the goods we could consume by working an hour and earning some income in that hour of work. But the idea is that at one point, eventually, we are so productive from an hour of work that we actually might take more leisures as our wages become higher and higher. And we're assuming here that wages reflect productivity. And just like as a thought experiment, imagine that tomorrow morning, you are able to produce in 1 hour of work the income necessary to satisfy your consumption of food, shelter, and clothing for a year in one hour. In the end of the year, would you work more? Would you work less? We're assuming from what we are levels of productivity today, levels of wages, to that high of a level of a wage per hour, a lot of people would, some people might actually work more now because they say I can satisfy higher material ends that I want, but some people might actually say, I want to enjoy more leisure. The idea is that your curve of labor supply eventually, and you can imagine that there's a relationship between how many hours you work and how high your wages are. For some time, your wages will go up, and they will go up with your higher wages will make your quantity of work go up, but eventually higher wages will make your quantity of work go down. Now, workaholics have a tipping point that's much further away. People who are more spiritual will have maybe a tipping point that's further to the left. And the idea here is that everyone has that trade-off, and what determines how far the tipping point is and where you are on that curve is general productivity in the economy, how much you produce in an hour of work, because that hour of work is what goods you command in terms of consumption from working.
Does economics have anything to say about some of the intangibles that people get out of work? I've often wondered what motivates some of the billionaires of the world, some of these big tech giants. What motivates them to get up for work in the morning? Because it's obviously something that goes beyond how productive they are and how much money they have. There's something else there. Is there any way to quantify that aspect of it?
So this is where there's a lot of mythology about economics, because people assume that when we talk productivity, we talk about how many widgets you produce per hour, but that's not exactly true. What we talk about when we talk about productivity is how much value is generated, and value being subjective to every individual. Value could be, for example, if we're so productive in an hour of work that we can satisfy this much demand for, say, the housing example that we gave, uh, you could decide to create value to yourself by going on vacations, by learning a particular art skills. You could invest in some form of personal achievement. This is why economists, when they talk about productivity as wealth creating, this is the mechanism by which we can create more wealth. Wealth is not just stacks of little pieces of paper that we put in a bank account and then they become zeros on a ledger. That's not what they are. Wealth is our ability to enjoy a greater set of choices. These choices could include more material consumption, but it could include non-material form of consumptions. And we can just think about like an image, because my field of specialty in economics is competition tier, like micro, but also applied to historical questions. Imagine how many choices of spiritual goods, or you could say art consumption or leisure, family investments. People in 1800, farmers in the middle of Ontario were all opening farms back then. How much leisure do you think they had? How much time for personal self-fulfillment on very individual, like very specific to an individual person's margins would be? That wasn't an option. But today, the idea that you can even participate in the idea of taking a few hours of work, of like when of your time when you're not working, because you're so productive, you can go on Coursera or Udemy and learn a new skill. You can go and see someone to talk about spirituality. You can see like this idea. I keep referring to this because the idea of spirituality is yours. It's not like because I care about it that much, because it opens the idea that wealth is our ability to exercise ways that we fulfill ourselves in terms of of utility to what matters to us. It's not just more widgets. Now, some people like more widgets. I like stuff. I'm one of those persons. I'm a workaholic. I work very long hours and I like to have those little goods. But the reality is, some other people are workaholics because what they want to buy with their greater productivity is a simpler life. They want to buy fewer hassles. They want to be able to just solve problem by saying, just here's money, leave me alone. Right? Sometimes it's that. Some people, it's the ability to spend time freely enjoying what makes life worth living. And actually, like, here's an even better example. Think about the proportion of people who produce forms of arts, writings, poems, paintings. What proportion of these people can actually not necessarily live gloriously, but at least meet their basic standards, food, shelter, clothing, relative to, say, 100 years ago? If you look at, for example, the biography of great artists, some of them worked as insurance underwriters at the same time and weren't able to dedicate themselves entirely to their craft. You will find names of great authors in the United States: Mark Twain, Edgar Allan Poe. In Canada, you'll find that Stephen Peacock had another career at the same time, because in those periods, it was impossible to live and actually dedicate yourself to something that was fulfilling on another margin full time. Now it's actually possible, not necessarily gloriously, but much better than in the past, to dedicate yourself fully to an art and live off of it. And that is an illustration of what the massive increase in productivity between 1800 and today, because people don't notice that, but on average in Canada, take the average worker, you take his hour of work today, it is 25 times greater than it was in 1800. So we are producing 25 times more than 1800. That means that we have 25 times more choices to which that we have access to make our lives better. Now, it can be material, can be immaterial, can be spiritual, can be non-spiritual, can be any form you care. But economists are actually able to talk about this. It's just that when we teach it, it's long. You notice that we've just like spent 2 minutes, maybe more, explaining this. But in classrooms, like at one point, I have to say, here's the dollar sign. And we're just going to say that it simplifies the conversation, right? Because we have to keep moving, right? I have 150 hours to teach you this stuff, right? So let's just get through this. And like we have to make some abstractions here, because otherwise we're just never going to be able to finish. But
It's
once you
such a
get the
good point.
abstraction,
My stepson ended up getting a fine arts degree, and we thought, uh-oh, but he's gone on to be a tattoo artist, and quite a successful tattoo artist, and he's probably going to be a business owner one day. Probably not a job that existed back in the 1800s. But I
no.
guess that's the other interesting part of it, isn't it? Is that, a lot of our economic theory gets handed down, and yet society is changing so quickly. I didn't think we'd start off talking about the 4-day work week, but maybe it's a good time for us to delve into that a little bit, because I I wonder how much demand there is for that based on the conversation that we're having. Is that when Fraser did the book on it and proposed a 4-day work week, where do you think what problem is that trying to solve? Is it that there is more demand for people to have more time so they can do all those other things we talked about, whether it's pursue a spiritual life or pursue a hobby or navigation or art, or is there some other reason why we would be looking at potentially encouraging government to go in that direction? What's the impetus behind talking about a 4-day work week?
So I want to make a nuance here. 4-day work week, not legislated, but made an effective possibility because people have this choice because they're so productive. And just to give you an idea of what we mean by a 4-day work week here, in 1870, the average worker was working more than 3,000 hours a year. And that's for pretty much every OECD country. There is no country in the OECD today where the average number of hours worked per worker is greater than 2,000. That is a 1/3 reduction in a span of a century and a half, close to. The idea here is, why would you have that? Because you're so much more productive that you are facing basically the idea that the marginal utility from one extra good is not the same as the first one. So people who are extremely poor, the extra wages give them so much more extra goods. But when you are so rich, because you are so productive, the extra good, the extra widget isn't getting you that much, right? The extra hour of work that you'd have to sacrifice relative to all you can do with your leisure is not worth the same. And the idea, and the other part that people tend to forget, is that leisure has also become incredibly more, and this is a weird thing because we also have to imagine the cost of leisure. Yes, we have to forsake things, but leisure, there's also things that you have to pay to access leisure, like buying an Xbox, because I am a particular, like, I'm still, in spite of my age, a gamer. I still play video games. But for example, you look at the price, even without adjusting for inflation, the price of video consoles have fallen dramatically. Gaming consoles are down, televisions are down, access to the range of goods, right? Just think about the cost of like a Netflix subscription versus going to the good old-fashioned Blockbuster and renting the same movies at $3.99 a pop. The idea that now leisure is so cheap, while we're also incredibly more productive, the two are being somewhat tied together. So what's happening is that the curve I've described earlier is that as we become productive, we move along the curve. But in a weird way, we're actually also shifting the curve a bit so that the tipping point happens at lower and lower levels of wages, so that some people can actually say, you know what, it's so cheap to enjoy now because we're so productive, we can enjoy like a better life because we can enjoy leisure, we can spend time with our kids, we can invest in, heck, even the idea that people can spend 8 hours in video game tournaments. That's what I should go. Video gaming tournaments are even the best illustration. There is people who invest in the leisurely act of competing in video game tournaments. That is the illustration of the such great productivity that we can enjoy so much leisure that in effect we are actually right now working the equivalent of 4 days a week. In fact,
It
we
is,
are.
it's such a good example too. I'll give you a video game tip if you give me one. Red Dead Redemption. I was told to get it for my husband for Christmas one year, and we just marveled that
It's a beautiful
$175
game.
game was able to give him literally days and days and days of fun playing the game. Anyway, you're going to give me your best recommendation at the end of it, but or
Sure.
maybe you can give it now. Do you have one now?
I'm a big fan of Star Wars Battlefront 2. I've been
Okay,
playing the one
beautiful.
since 2015. I still can't stop.
Now I know I'm getting him for Christmas. But it is interesting because I think that this is the other part of it, is that just gave another really good example. There are some gamers who are making a career out of what started out as a leisure activity because of the awards that they're winning out of it. And so and we all have this huge discussion going on about a fourth industrial revolution and the way in which technology is going to transform the workplace once again, make jobs no longer available or relevant, or I suppose as readily available. And I'm wondering if you have, if we're going to, what we might see develop out of that. Is there anything that you can, if you could imagine 200 years from now, are we going to be talking about having a 1,000 hours a year of work? Are we going to see the number of hours of productive work reducing even more? Is there any way to know if there's some kind of optimal level of work-life balance?
I'm not a big fan of doing predictions about the future, which is why my field of expertise in economic, as I said, is economic history. So it's easier for me to look back. But even looking back, it's actually quite easy to be optimistic, uh, because people underappreciate how much human progress there has been. So, like we've mentioned, like for example, the number of hours worked, but that proportion actually doesn't capture everything, because we're capturing people who are presently working, but we're not capturing the fact that we live much longer now. So we actually retire and get actually to spend some time in retirement rather than dying at work, which was what most people did in the past. And not only that, but now we also enter the workforce not at 14 or 15 like my dad did when he was a kid, or my mom did. I entered the workforce at 21. That is a very massive difference in a lifetime when you're considering the difference in times of work. And if you look at the proportion of your life awake, so we assume throughout your life that you sleep on average 8 hours a day, which is not exactly true for parents, but it averages out when you include the years of teenagers. But that joke being put aside, because I'm a young parent myself, 8 hours is clearly something I would dream for. But if you take that idea, that presumption, there is 16 hours left a day of time awake, what proportion of that time in your entire life do you spend working and not working? And in 1850 and in the 1870s, we were talking about roughly 75% of that time was spent working. Today, we are talking to roughly less than 45%.
Huh.
So we are spending more of our lives now in leisurely pursuits than we are before. And if actually we check assumptions about sleeping, people actually do get to sleep more now than they did in the past. So people don't notice that, but people in the past actually had really low quality sleep. There's actually some of my colleagues who work on that. There's a field that's called economics and human biology, where we try and make some inferences about, because there's biological ramifications of poor sleep quality, we can have some ideas of how much people could sleep in the past, or using time diaries. And we know that people in the past actually didn't get the chance to sleep as much as we do today. So that 45% might even be even lower than that. So that we spend the vast majority of our lives today in rich, productive countries in leisurely pursuit. And that's because we are productive, not because we've legislated something into existence that we've legislated. Because if it had been this easy, farmers in the Middle Ages would have asked for legislation asking them not to work that much if it was that easy. But the reality is that what makes it possible is our productivity. Our productivity makes it possible for us to increase the choices that we can exercise, the sets of choices that we have available. And that includes the choices where we take more times for ourselves.
It's remarkable the way you've put that too, because it's not just that we're working fewer hours in a day and fewer days of the week, but we're also entering the workforce later and leaving earlier. So I guess from what I've heard you say, we'll probably see a number of those factors continue: shorter work days, shorter
Yep.
work weeks, and also a shorter period of time of productive work over our lifestyle, or over
Yes,
our lifetime.
and actually, as a kind of a neat little thing, there's this economist, John Maynard Keynes, who I'm not generally fond of, but he made in the 1920s a prediction saying that by the year 2000 we'd be working 15 hours a week. And a lot of people have made fun of him because it didn't materialize, but actually it did. Because if you take that proportion that I've just mentioned, that we work so few hours, that we in a year, that we work so few years, that we work and you adjust, so that even if you arrive, you make all these corrections, right? So throughout your entire life. So you try to average it out over a lifetime. You actually are getting very close to 15. And let's say you include, for example, the quality of the work. So you try and see how hard the work is. You try to like and weigh down the fact that my grandfather was working in southern Italy as back-breaking work farming that actually like hurt him, that was physically painful. And my dad was working in an office. I am standing in front of students telling them that economics is great if you adjust for like the enjoyability factor of work, so that it's like you are less taxed, so that when you leave work you actually can enjoy leisure because you're not physically exhausted to the point of being physically broken. Then you actually could get something that speaks to the 15 hours a week average. The idea is we're very close to this prediction. So when people say, like, where would we be in 100 years? I don't exactly know, but I am very optimistic because the long run trend over 2 and 3 centuries of human history, where we've had this incredible boom in productivity that started with the Industrial Revolution, we have never enjoyed such an unparalleled increase in our ability to have free time. And I see things that are slowing it down, that are slowing down these increases, but not to the point of stopping them. So I am optimistic. I don't want to make a prediction, but I am optimistic.
It's an interesting conversation because I think we always look to government to solve problems of equity, and I think the way you framed this out is fascinating to see just how much things have improved. If we all were to take a time machine and go back 200 years and think of the kind of work and the kind of hours we would have been doing 200 years ago, I think it's very eye-opening. But we're almost now though at a point where we're not working enough to pay for all the government programs that we want. And I want to transition into the talk about daycare because I'm sure that that is part of the notion behind why it is we need to have, according to some politicians and political leaders, why we need to have a subsidized universal daycare program. Is they're thinking we need to get more people working longer hours in those prime earning years because we need to generate more tax revenue so that we can pay for all of the programs that we have. I don't know that there's a single government in Canada that is in a balanced budget situation, or whose finances are looking great, especially I suppose post COVID. And so the talk about a Quebec style daycare program is taking place at the federal level. It's a little annoying in Alberta because Alberta had asked for the same kind of proposal that Quebec had, which is we'll opt out of the program, just give us the money. Alberta asked for the same thing and they were told no, because you're not doing it the way the federal government or the way Quebec is doing it. And so we need to understand a bit about some of the reasons behind that, how the Quebec program is structured, what problem it is that they're trying to solve. So let's begin with the issue of equity when it comes to women. Is it, I mean, can you look at the data and see that women would make different choices because of the fact that they're managing childcare issues, and that there is a policy need to try to equalize the playing field? Can we map that out a little bit to understand why this program is gaining so much traction?
Okay, so the idea that generally comes in with daycare is that in our discussion of like labor leisure trade-off, there is an extra cost to women of going into the workforce, which is that they are the ones that are bearing the majority of the child rearing decisions, largely for just biological reasons of pregnancy. Uh, and for that reason, there's this assumption that uh, they're going to be penalized by leaving the market for a year or two, so that there's what we call scarring effects that happen on their earnings. So they enter, like, they lose potential experience, they grow disconnected in very fast-paced fields like law or financial practices. There might be like actual financial losses for potential earning losses for women. And so we say, but there's still like people who are like women who are trained in law have immense human capital. And the assumption is that, okay, well, how do we get them back into the labor force? Because we don't want that human capital to depreciate. One potential issue, one issue that's argued, is that the cost for women of re-entering the market is the childcare cost. So that For them, it actually, even though they'd be willing to do it at the prevailing market wage, the prevailing market wage has to be somewhat deflated by the proportion that of these extra wages that will go to childcare. So in these situations, a lot of women who are very potentially productive workers, who are very highly skilled, will not re-enter the workforce, and so will have larger scars in by staying longer out of the market than say say the last one, the pregnancy, a month or two after birth. The idea is that they stay longer because the cost of re-entering the workforce does not make up the eats up too many of the wage benefits that they get.
Do we have
And
any good data on that to know if there is an optimal period of time to be out of the workplace and not lose that advantage versus how long is too long? It's a strange argument to be made
it,
because especially when we have all the technological change we were just talking about, I have been told that I think that even a 4-year degree program, the doubling of knowledge is taking place so quickly that what you need to learn by the end of a 4-year degree is completely different than when you started. And so in some ways, all of us have to keep our skills up in this really fast-paced world. And I wonder if there is some way of wrapping our heads around how much time can you take out of a job for whatever reason with before you start having that scarring effect you're talking about.
it very much varies according to the profession. So, for
Hmm.
example, I remember one article. I can't see it on the top of my head which journal it was in, but it showed that women in law actually had very big scars very early on from practice, but in other fields like nursing, the scars were not that big and took a long time to materialize. So there was a longer time that was able to take off. High school teaching also had a difference, but there were some domains in which women actually did suffer important scars from exiting, from being out of the market for a long period. So it's not uniform for everyone. It's also not necessarily uniform for every worker within the field. So what I'm describing are what you could call average effects. They're indicative, but it doesn't mean that it's like the same for everyone. So I'd be careful about how big of a scar. But the idea here from people, so we represent their argument properly, is that by subsidizing daycare, especially for low income households who still have like very high like earning potentials, you are making it possible for them to re-enter the labor market and so not suffer the earnings loss, so that you have a program that helps them send their kids to daycare, and as a result you get, by virtue of subsidizing, you get an increase in the labor force participation of mothers with young age kids. So we're talking about mothers with kids between, say, 6 months and 5 years old. So everything before they enter, maybe even six, everyone in that group, which is where you find for women, if you actually take profile of labor force participation by the the age of women, but you adjust for whether or not they have kids. Women in child rearing age who have kids between 2 and 5, there's a big dip in their labor force participation, largely because the cost of rearing kids is. I mean, I find it hard as a father. I can't imagine. Like, I try to imagine how much my wife is finding it difficult. But it is incredibly costly on in terms of personal engagement. The cost of daycare, according to the proponents of subsidized daycare, is that you are reducing a cost that makes it harder for women to who have young kids to re-enter the labor market. That's their argument, and it's not a bad one because costs do matter, right? People are sensitive. If you reduce the cost of something, people will do more of it. If you increase the cost of something, people will do less of it. So if you reduce the cost of essentially returning to the labor force, it makes sense that you could say that there is bound to be a greater proportion of mothers who will return to the labor force.
It's so interesting because I think in some ways we have policy that might be in conflict with each other. And so I'm sort of trying to wrap my head around what the best policy might be. Because when my mother was having children, maternal leave, and it wasn't available to men as well, but maternity leave was only 3 months. So there was some expectation that you'd get back into the workforce quickly. Over time, it's now spread. You can take your benefits and spread them out over 2 years. And so the idea of having a subsidized daycare program, because we've got to get women back into the workforce as quick as possible. And wait a minute, we want you to stay at home as long as possible in those first 2 years to make it easier for you. Those seem to be in conflict with each other. That's why I'm trying to wonder what the principal objective of government is when they're setting policy. Can you elaborate on why we have what looks like a bit of a bipolar type of approach to this?
I okay, so you're asking me an opinion about politics. This is where I am woefully ill-equipped
So you
to
think
make.
it is just politics? Like there
I,
wouldn't be any reason why, the first 2 years we don't. I mean, if you could talk to me about the scarring effect, and 2 years is sort of they've determined that actually the benefits of being at home with the child outweigh the risk of losing your position in the workplace. There would be some sense around that. But it also then could imply if you want to provide income support, especially now that we're coming out of the post-COVID era where we're providing people $2,000 a month, you could say, why don't we just extend that type of approach and allow women to stay home for 3 years or 4 years or 5 years until their kids are able to go into school, and then they can make the transition. I'm just trying to figure out how do we build on the program that we have with the existing leave, or do we try to extend the Quebec-based program? I'm trying to think through what would be an
okay,
optimal type of approach depending on what it is we're trying to achieve.
there's multiple threads here that we have to disentangle. So the first one is, why do we have conflicting policies? I think here it's easy for me as an economist who does public choice theory, so the economics of politics. Generally, when I find policies that are schizophrenic, bipolar, as you call them, it's generally not good to look at it from the perspective of what makes sense economically, in the sense of outcomes, but in the sense of what makes sense from the incentives of politicians. What are their incentives? And in this situation, generally, that is more easier to explain. Here, we expect parents are generally bigger voters, they're more active, they are generally a bit richer, they have a series of certain behaviors that correlate with political success if you are able to cater to them. So that's how I would
Mhm.
explain the weird set of policies. But the second thread is, how much would subsidized daycare matter? I think this is where it doesn't matter that much, uh, because if the objective, because the way I've simplified it earlier, is what we care about is the cost of going back to work. Now, there is a series of ways we can alter that cost. Subsidizing daycare might be one of them, but there might be other ways that would actually be cheaper. So, for example, my friend Diana Thomas from Creighton University in Nebraska, what she did, uh, she actually checked at regulations in the United States at the state level, and they're essentially regulation on childcare provision, so child staff ratios, degree requirement, the regulations that actually, by the way, are not very well correlated with the quality of the service, because
Hmm.
they're just the ones that regulators can understand. So when the bureaucrats are designing the rules with the politicians, they're the ones that they can actually make legible, even though they might not necessarily matter that much on the ground. But these regulations have a massive impact on cost. So, for example, just allowing one extra kid per one extra kid per educator could reduce cost on average of roughly 10%. So if you say
Hmm.
daycare is too expensive, which makes sense, it is very well. I'm not saying it's too expensive. I'm saying it's the market price now. For some person is for some people is too expensive to return to the labor force. I should be precise as an economist. But if you care about reducing that cost, one way to do so is maybe remove some burdensome regulations. That would be one way of reducing the cost so that women would re-enter the workforce. Another way is that, for example, one of the big costs for daycare is rent and shelter. And in cities like Vancouver, Toronto, where housing and land use regulations are so high that they drive up rents, they drive up accidentally childcare costs. So, for example, in the United States, when you check uh, uh, low regulation areas in terms of land use, so how easily you can use land and create extra new services, build new buildings, you find that their care costs are heavily affected by land use regulations. So if you care about reducing it, maybe some other measures on the side would matter more. So for example, like I used to be before I was at George Mason, I was at Texas Tech. So I'm a Quebecer that keeps going to the United States. But at Texas Tech, the daycare's in Lubbock, Texas, which is a small city, but that has basically no regulation whatsoever. It is the most weirdly built city. But the reality is that you can get a center-based daycare for $700 a month over there, which is incredible because in other cities like Fairfax, Virginia, where I am now, daycare costs run in excess of $1,500, and it's one of the most regulated cities in the United States. So here you have another way. If you deregulated land use, you would reduce the cost of childcare accidentally. But you know the biggest cost for people of going to work is paying income taxes.
Yes.
So if you care about, if you're saying to people are it's costly for you to go to work because of childcare, well, what you're saying is actually no, is that the wage benefit of going to work are too small relative to the cost. Well, what's one of the costs? One of the costs is the income tax that you're taking from them. So maybe income taxes would actually be one way to go at it, reducing them. And actually, if you notice that in the empirical literature, women are much more sensitive than men to reductions in tax cuts, like a ratio of 2 to 1. So if you reduce tax cuts, if you cut taxes by roughly, like, say, 1%, you'll find that men increase their labor supply, their hours worked by somewhere between 0.2 and 0.3%. If you do the same reduction for women, it will be between 0.3 and 0.6%. So women generally will have twice the sensitivity of men to taxes. So if you reduce income taxes or payroll taxes, you will find that you'll find a differential effect where more women will increase. There'll be more increased participation from women than men. And that's largely driven, by the way, when we broke down the data, we actually find that it's generally driven by mothers. Mothers are even more sensitive. Young age kids, mothers to young age kids are even more sensitive to tax cuts. So the idea here is, from people who talk about subsidized daycare, what they're I think, I'm not refuting their argument that subsidizing daycare will not cause women to return to work. It will cause some women to go to work, but you have to compare it with policy alternatives. And the other policy alternatives are generally they kick butts. They are very, very, very effective. And the reason why is that when you actually, and there's a Statistics Canada paper on that, when you actually ask mothers to rate the costliest, the biggest barriers for them of returning to work, childcare costs, they do come in pretty big, but they're only third or fourth on the list behind, for example, transit costs or time commuting or taxes.
Oh, that's fascinating. Okay, you've put a lot on the table here, and um, one more vein I want to explore, because when we're talking about where the impetus for these kinds of policies come from, is, and this is the cynic in me, is that it often seems like it is being pushed by a labor group with the idea that we'll end up with a single style of government-run, unionized workplace. And then when you start playing around with staff ratios, that kind of explains the regulatory aspect. Because if you say you can only have 6 children for every caregiver or 5 children for every caregiver, that just increases the number of people that you have to hire to be able to meet those regulations.
Or
And so
increase the
this is,
cost.
or increase the cost. Exactly. So I'm wondering, when we look at the Quebec environment, what the principal driver was when that I think it was initially introduced as a $5 a day daycare program.
Yeah.
Was it being driven from mums asking for it, from governments needing the revenue, or from labor groups saying we want to be able to have more workers providing this service?
Uh, there was there was a mixture of all of these. There were clearly families in Quebec who were arguing that childcare was expensive and that the previous system was a bit of a mess, because there was a system of tax credits that was income that was fixed according to people's income level, and the payment was once a year. There was some arguments that it created some problems. Labor unions were pretty big on it. So there was a mixture of, and this is generally the case with policies, some people who are generally very well meaning, who are what we could call public interest justifications. But then you always have some people you could call, as an economist, we call them public choice or slash rent seekers. It's people who have actually some incentive in the policy being enacted, not from a virtue of arguing for societal welfare, but from the perspective of their own group or individualistic perspective that the policy is in their favor. And from this, unions in Quebec have definitely won a lot from the program. But the thing that people need to understand is that the program, so one big paper that keeps getting cited, but that no one actually in the literature, so people who publish in peer-reviewed journal, actually cite to basically take it around the block like a dead horse and beat it until it's dead, or use it in classrooms to show how you not do certain work for good economics. It said that there was from Quebec that the subsidized daycare in the 1970s had the effect of on net causing 60,000 women to return to the labor force. And with that 60,000 extra mothers on the labor force annually, you get so much more income for the government that actually the program paid for itself. The reason, first of all, when people revisited this, first of all, when they made that calculation, they assumed that the women who entered the labor force had the same wages as people who were previously in the labor force. And that's incorrect. At the margin, you expect that the women who were deterred by childcare costs of entering probably were facing lower potential wages than otherwise would be the case. As soon as you corrected for that, the effect disappeared. It actually became a net drag. But actually, the other reason is there is what we call so this is, I'm going to try and not make this too technical. What we have, so when we do estimation of the causal effect of a policy, we need to have a proper identification strategy. And that looks like a lab experiment. We need to have one place that gets a policy or a treatment, like people get a drug, and there's a group that's the placebo group that's a control group that doesn't get the treatment. You need to make sure that there is nothing else that would conflate the results. So you say the group that gets the treatment, so Quebec, the treatment it gets in the 1990s is subsidized daycare at $5 a day. If you need to have all the other provinces not have that, but also not have other policy changes that work in the same direction, because you want to attribute whatever change that happened in Quebec that don't happen elsewhere to be assigned exactly to the policy. The problem is that is not the case. At the same time, in the 1990s, the federal liberals are doing an amazing reform to employment insurance, and the result of that reform to employment insurance is the same as subsidized daycare. And essentially, what it means is that women who are out of the labor force, one of the reasons they stayed out of the labor force is because the program is very generous. When you have the reform that makes the program less generous, then the cost of staying out of the labor market is actually greater, so you have to re-enter. When you adjust for that and you try to say, okay, let's compare with the provinces that were most affected by the reform to employment insurance, because then in that group, you get Quebec that gets the effect of employment insurance reform, but only in the daycare, and then the Atlantic provinces that are also heavily affected by employment insurance, but not the daycare reform. You find an effect that, yes, Quebec mothers did went back to work, but the number is probably closer to 10,000 a year extra, not 60,000.
So with the implications of that being what? So if it is only 10,000 additional women going back, generating income taxes, what percentage of the overall cost of daycare does that incremental increase in taxes cover? Because that's the argument that is being made about why we approach this is, oh, it'll pay for itself. And I've heard that
Roughly
argument.
40%.
You're saying no, 40%.
Roughly 40%. And let's notice something. Quebec was exceptional amongst Canadian provinces. Quebec had the lowest rate of women labor force participation in Canada at that time. One of the lowest. Prince Edward Island was close, but Prince Edward Island is 4 people. That's me making a joke. If there's a colleague of mine, I know he listens to some of my stuff. He's from Prince Edward Island. I just made a jab at him. But anyways, so Putting
You're going
aside
to be
things,
hearing about it. He's going to email you. I think it's about
yeah,
the size of our one of our mid-sized cities, Red Deer. I think
yes,
there's about
yes.
100,000
But
people. So
it is beautiful. I love I honestly love Prince Edward Island, but it's always fun to take a quick jab at PEI. But the idea here is that Quebec was so low that the policy was bound to have an effect in that environment because there was so much slack. Now, if you compare with places like Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Manitoba, these provinces have not only historically, but at that time and now, very high level of labor force participation for women, especially Alberta, suggesting that the lower tax rates do play for something in the story. Uh, in that environment, you are much less likely to have an effect from subsidizing daycare
hmm.
because the women that are probably out of the labor force by that point, there are some of them that we have to respect their choices. Some of them actually make a deliberate choice to leave the labor force. So some women actually use motherhood. So we have like a small literature on this that some mothers use motherhood to take a time to retrain, to re-enter a new field, and then because that's in the way they're structuring their decision, they are not likely to be very sensitive to reducing the cost of childcare. Some women actually make it a choice to be mothers at home, and it's their dedication to that, and it's their choice. But people like this are marginal. They're not a great number, but because they are so marginal, they're unlikely to be affected by, say, a 15, 20, 25% reduction in the daily cost of sending your kid to daycare. So they won't change their behavior because of that, because they're so far away from that particular change in marginal cost. Now, if you made daycare like for them, you gave them like $1,000 to send their kids to daycare, some of them probably would. Uh, but the reality is that it's a situation, unless you do something extreme, they won't react. And in places like Alberta, where the labor force participation is already very high for mothers, you are in that situation where the policy is unlikely to replicate whatever Quebec was able to do because Quebec was starting from so far behind everybody else except Prince Edward Island.
Isn't that interesting? Because that makes the case for why childcare policies should be determined at the provincial level based
Yes.
on provincial conditions as opposed to a single national approach based on the model in Quebec. So that
Yep.
thank you for that because I think that's a great argument. Now let me ask you if we should be looking at a couple of other layers because maybe just looking at the incremental increase in the mother's income tax that she's or income that she's paying and the tax that she's paying, maybe we actually have to look at the fact that she would have a reduced, as you termed it, scarring on her employment record. So maybe over time she would end up paying more in income taxes than if she stayed at home longer. Maybe we also have to look at the level of income taxes that all the additional workers that are in the daycare system are being paid as another benefit that we get, just so that we're not understating the benefit of the program. Is there some merit to that?
Well, the thing is, the problem with subsidies, and this is where, again, I don't want to get too technical, is that by subsidizing something, you are pushing people into doing more of something that they wouldn't have done before under a free market. So that means that you have to reallocate resources from other sectors. So when you take like a general equilibrium approach, it could be that you are subsidizing daycare, and as a result, there's more daycare worker. But that could mean that, for example, industries that were competing for these workers. So it could be nursing care, it could be elderly care, it could be primary teachers, or you could look at these. In these sectors, you'll find that they are forced to pay higher wages to attract workers.
Mm.
They're less able, so they'll be forced to some degree to reduce output. So subsidies like have this distortionary effect that have ramifications, which is why when we take like an even bigger approach than just that very small market, the benefits become even harder and harder to defend to the point that there's clearly like a very high cost to society. The one argument, and I'm very big on being generous to people who I disagree with, because it's a sign not only of respect but of understanding what they're trying to get at. There is one very good argument that they have regarding the importance of childcare, and that importance is that kids Early childhood development is very, 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 very. I could keep going for an hour with the very related to later life outcomes. Kids who have good early developments have high incomes. They have higher soft skills, and when I mean soft skills, it's soft skills are stuff like interpersonality, the ability to communicate, to socialize, to solve abstract problem, convert abstract information into practical information. These soft skills are much more important than cognitive skills to development. And early childhood policies have a big impact on these. And so some of the arguments that some people will, based on that literature, will make is that by subsidizing daycare, by sending kids to daycare, you will improve these kids' development. And so the returns are going to be latent and come 10, 15, 25 years from now, which is not an unreasonable argument, given that the literature on early childhood outcomes is pretty consensual. There are debates here and there on some technicalities, but no one disagrees that this is a big deal. This is a really big deal. It's actually probably one of the low-hanging fruits that we have.
Well, but you're going to give me the results, but tell me when you're talking about early childhood development, because again, my thinking is around, do we
0 to
have
10.
so 0 to 10? So the
Yep.
first 2 years, we are encouraging kids to be at home with mom or dad, and
Not
then there's
necessarily.
this.
It would
Well,
be like
with the I was just saying with the maternity and paternity leave policy that we have, we're encouraging kids to stay or parents to stay home for 2 years.
okay, I see what you mean.
You see what I mean? And
Yep.
then there's this middle period from age 3 to 5 that we're trying to solve this problem with the subsidized daycare. And then once they hit 5, now they're already in the K to 12 education system. So we're looking at I'm trying to understand what is you're saying, so the early childhood development 0 to 10 most important. Is there anywhere along that spectrum where it's most important? Is the 3 to 5 year age group the most crucial one?
0 to 6 is the most important
0
bit,
to
but there's
6.
still some big effect up to
Hmm.
10. That's when kids' brains are very malleable. So they're very, very influenced by early development. Uh, this would be where you would try, and for example, James Heckman, who is the Nobel laureate in economics from, I'm going to say 2000. I'm not sure. I don't remember the year, but he is really big on that literature. And he keeps pointing out that the 2 to 6 is probably even more important than 0 to 6. And then there's some people will probably know her when I mention her because she has a lot of these. She's an economist from Brown University, but she has these books that have become wide public. Emily Oster. She has Crib Sheet, Expecting Better, and Family Sheet, which is basically three books destined to parents, early young kid parents or pregnant mothers, about the economics of pregnancy and early childhood. And she's like a world-class researcher, and she just makes the literature completely accessible. And it has information like, should you circumcise your kids? Like, are there like, because there's a big debate, like why, for example, Americans have high rates of circumcisions in kids. Canadians do not. Europeans do not. Why the divide? Well, she points out, like, she doesn't try to answer why there's a divide, but she points out that here's what the literature says about health benefits. Here's what the literature says about this. It's not clear that there's a benefit. So should you really do it? There's some signs that there might be some small benefits, but don't do it because maybe not that big given the potential downsides. So she gives access to the literature on this. And she gives
Interesting. So,
access.
so I'm hearing you say that there's virtual unanimity across the board that this period, age 2 to 6, absolutely crucial,
A
early
big deal.
childhood development. So here's the question: does daycare address
Exactly.
the early childhood development needs? What does the literature show there?
So that's where you can start disagreeing. So agreeing on whether or not childhood matters a lot is actually, like, I don't even know why we needed the economists to do it. It's fun to like, it's fun for my craft that we got work and we were able to show this empirically, and it's fun to like actually like put meat around the bone. But I don't think anyone is surprised when we say childhood matters. But that is different from saying policy. Which
Mhm.
policy will achieve greater outcomes on that particular dimension at the like on a net benefit for society. That's where child care policy is not really that big of a deal. So we have the evidence from Quebec that came in. So the work came in mostly from Kevin Milligan from the University of British Columbia, and what they find, and Michael Baker from the University of Toronto. What they find is that actually on net, a subsidized daycare in Quebec, the universal daycare program, actually caused cognitive losses for kids in the lowest income strata. And that actually fits with another finding from that literature, is that what matters most to kids' development is not necessarily the child care environment they're in. It does matter, but the family connections, the role of family is a much bigger deal. So if you were like to try and say what gives the cookie, like what gives you the cake, family is like the batter, the vanilla, the icing, and childcare is like the sprinkles you put on top. Right?
Okay.
It makes the cake fun. It makes the cake better, but it's not what makes the cake a cake. Family influences. So, for example, giving parents information about uh, tips to child rearing. So, for example, the Emily Oster book, I didn't mention that for a particular, like I didn't bring it in for no reason. It's actually because that book probably has more effect than childcare policies, in my opinion. Because, for example, she has an entire chapter on sudden infant death, which is a big fear for young parents, that their kids just stop breathing in the middle of the night. Especially like the ones from 0 to 6. If you give parents information about the medical literature and you try to break it down to them in a way that's understandable, parents actually will incorporate that very, very well. And they're the ones that matter most to a child's early life outcome. The same book talks about the importance of not baby babu babu baby to the kids, but actually talk to them, but slowly, with a certain sense of being kind, but also like actually using words,
Using real words.
real words, and that has probably an effect on development. And these are things that probably matter more. Uh, and in one things that would matter more, and that relates to what we were discussing about what else could actually cause daycare to happen, is, for example, if a mother becomes, so for example, we're talking about reducing income taxes, and a mother can spend more time at home as well, because uh, she gets to go to work, she gets an extra income, she can buy vacation time with her kids, she can do a series of other possibilities. These will be tied to the connection between parents and kids. And one effect, for example, is that we know this from the literature, is there's actually like a small tie-in effect, where when women go back to work, fathers actually drop a bit their hours, so that fathers get more times with their kids. That is also a benefit from the policy. So you can get some of the cognitive outcome that they claim just by doing some of the other policies that I've mentioned that would reduce the cost of childcare, by having parents more present at home, by like the father put a bit more time in at home, have a more even-handed relationship between parents, rather than having exclusively the mother or exclusively the father. Now you have like a mixture of both. So you actually like have a two-parent household, and it works. So you actually don't have like one parent that's continually exhausted from that one kid. And you get like a mixture. You get a tag teaming. You get parents that are more patient. Just because you've been able to create like an opportunity for where people can actually do more work sharing in that situation. Less financial stress. For example, if you deregulate daycare and the costs are lower, one of the results would be that parents will carry less stress around from other activities, and that will seep onto the kids. You can get a lot of the cognitive benefits that these people talk for subsidizing daycare by other means, accidentally, but by other means.
So here's where I'm caught up on what you said, because I think what some of the argument that you would hear social activist and equity groups argue is the reason you want to do this is because the lower income individuals might not, it might be that a household is low income because there is only a single parent. It might be that there are factors around having to work extra hours. Perhaps they're low income. Perhaps there's English as a second language learning needs or issues. And so you would expect that the social activists would argue that this is an equity producing outcome. You want the lowest income families to have access to this. And yet you just told me that you're seeing cognitive decline in the very income group, this program you would think would be the strongest argument for implementing it. What is happening there?
This is because these people are conflating equity and heterogeneity. You should care. Kids are incredibly different. Uh, there is you, and not only that, but they will vary according to the milieu they're in, the cultural backgrounds of their parents. Uh, there's a lot of varying factors, which means that a one size fits all is not going to work well. And bureaucracies are not good at allowing. So if you bureaucratize, create a form of monopoly, regulate it, and don't allow a market to create product product variety, what you're going to end up with is a one size fits all. And kids don't fare well in one size fits all. A market that tries to say cater to different margins. So, for example, you have a daycare for kids who have, say, for example, development problems. So, for example, you would include these spectrums, kids on the spectrum. You would have mixed groups, for example, there, because sometimes apparently, now I'm not very familiar with that particular aspect of the literature, but sometimes there's some arguments being made that kids with on the spectrum actually do need to be around a decent proportion of kids that are not on the spectrum, so that at least like they learn to socialize to some degree or control their emotions, so that they can at least not control but read their emotions, because that's the very difficult problem for kids on the spectrum, is understanding what they're feeling, and or speak it properly to parents. So in environments like these, like this is an area where markets will be able to see, and because they have an incentive by the profit motive to cater to particular groups of parents, to offer personalized services. Bureaucracies are not able
Hmm.
to do this. They have to do a one size fits all that the bureaucrats and the Department of Family can actually read and make legible. But when you make it legible and you make it a one size fits all, you're bound to have some kids that are square pegs and round holes, and thus you get the losses that I've mentioned for Quebec. That is the economic reasoning behind, because you've lost the virtue of the flexibility in creating heterogeneity in service of product variety. You've lost this from the competitive aspect of the market, and that's why not only can you get the benefits in terms of childhood development by other policies that don't meddle with market, that actually reduce the shadow of government on markets, but you are more likely to get them. But with government, you're unlikely to get them, and you may actually do more harm because of this inherent feature of government, which is that they can't, unless they just give the money to people, which is the one policy I'd be okay with. Just give them a voucher, just give them like a
Hmm.
transfer that's income modulated. If you really care about the poor and you care that they need to have access to some childcare, then you just give them cash. You just say, here's $1,000, send your kid to daycare if you want, right?
Okay.
That's it.
Well, good, because I was getting concerned, because my approach to daycare is I really do want to see a targeted approach to those most in need. So
Yeah.
I was wondering, well, how do we address this low income group? You've kind of answered that question, but let's talk, and we may come back to it. But I want to talk more broadly about why it is that the Quebec program is structured the way it is, because I'll tell you an irritation for me. It goes to this entire point of equity. Is yes, we realize, as you pointed out, that you want to have some of those high paying professions like nurses or teachers or lawyers continue to have seamless employment, but they're also high income earners. And so if you've got a family of two lawyers, and some of the lawyers here, I'm not sure how it is in Quebec, some of the lawyers here make 300,000 a year. So two family lawyers, 600,000 a year. Why in the world do they need subsidized daycare? My
Exactly.
view is they should pay for it themselves. And so so to me, the argument of universality falls down for the very reason of why you want to get high paid women back into the workforce. You get the reward, and the extra income in itself should be enough to pay. And general taxpayers shouldn't have to subsidize that. Now, I may be in the minority on this, because clearly people like a universal approach to this. But what is the alternative argument? Why has this program been implemented in a way that's universal?
Uh, that part I still have a hard time understanding it, because there's a lot of moving pieces and things that were probably said behind closed doors that we don't know. The part that we do know for sure is that in Quebec, the unions have loved this because in subsidized daycare, you get by having a unified network, you get one party negotiating with another party rather than having a host and a slew of different unions to deal with, so that
Mm,
you are simplifying labor relations from the perspective of the unions. And the other part is that you're actually reducing competition. So for the union, what you're essentially doing is that by increasing the demand for their services, you are making it more likely that they're able to extract higher wages uh, from the government because they're essentially crowding out the portions of the private market. And this is where I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of actually saying this is the way it has to be produced. Now, I'm not fond of actually like even vouchers for childcare because I
mm.
think that the policies I've mentioned earlier are going to yield the effect that we want. But if we have to, and I wouldn't mind like doing a compromise because I'm not an unreasonable person. You can't tell the market how to produce the service. You have to just help you have to produce an income modulated approach. So poor parents get more than rich parents, and actually rich parents would actually get close to nothing. And you just say, okay, if you're very poor, because the cost is the same for everyone, right? The monetary cost. My apologies. Given that the monetary cost is the same for everyone, the opportunity cost is greater for poor household, which is why you would want to compensate them more than rich households. Uh, then you transfer according to income, but then you don't create the distortions in the market. You still allow the product variety to come in, and you are actually helping at the very least the people who need access to this and thus have some of the cognitive benefits that we've mentioned earlier. But these you can get them without a universal program. You actually do target something that's more geared to poor families. So again, it's not that the people who are advocating this have a bad intention. Some people I do think are therein for their own benefit, but the vast majority of it are arguing it from a public interest perspective. But if you really do it from a public interest perspective, there are other policies that are more cost effective that not only are cheaper, that's what I should say, but also yield much more benefits in the long run. So these are the ones we should be pursuing. Now, these are the ones that are less flashy, so that they're less desirable for politicians. You'll notice we've been talking about this for an hour now. Uh, this is something that's really long to explain. The the roundabout ways I've mentioned to reduce the cost of daycare would require, for example, like I said, I mentioned land use regulation that would deregulate the construction of new buildings so that the housing supply goes up in a way that reduces rents for childcare centers. Same thing with the deregulation of certain aspect of quality, so that it actually relates to market mechanisms. By the way, I don't even believe that the government needs to regulate that much the quality of daycare.
Hmm.
You have a million websites on there that provide evaluations, that have the reference systems. You have care.com. You have reviews online. You have testimonies. They have the equivalent of an ISO norm, which should tell you that the market is able to produce the checks and balances that are necessary for parents to ensure the quality. And in the competitive markets, the more you allow possibilities to come in, then it will matter to people.
Well, let's talk about that because I know that you have made an expertise in studying competition, and I think that is a really important aspect of this, of why competition is important. And I'm persuaded by the argument that lower income parents will need some support. I'm persuaded by the argument that a voucher system that phases out over time is probably the most effective way of replicating a market type of model. But tell us what the consequences have been of doing the opposite. I want to understand what some of the pitfalls are that we want to avoid in Quebec, because I think the sense that we have outside of Quebec is that it operates very much like the K to 12 education
No,
system, that everybody has access. No, there are no waiting lists. No one has to pay a tuition fee. You're intermingling kids from a variety of different backgrounds and incomes in the same classroom. It's utopia. That's it. So I think that's the model we think exists in this early childhood area. What is the reality of what exists?
so initially, when the program started in Quebec, there were very long waiting lists. So there were a lot of parents who were waiting. And one of the effects of the policy was that the private sector got crowded out for a few years. But eventually the waiting list got so costly that private non-subsidized daycare has been exploding in the last decade or so. From initially in the early 2000s, a few years after the reform, private non-subsidized daycare, if I remember properly from my study, I'm trying to forget, I'm not trying not to forget the proportions, was I think close to 0.5%, so less than a percent. That was something like that. It was an insanely low proportion of places that were being fulfilled that were fulfilled by private operators. Today, we're talking in excess of 20%. I just found the number. So it was 0.98% in 2003, 8% in 2011, and 21% in 2017. So the reality is that the waiting lists got so incredibly long that the result was that the only ones who were willing to provide it was actually the private sector. This is, I mean, if we are talking about testimony to the efficacy of the program, I actually this is it even cuts even bigger against the argument that people have made that that it actually uh, had massive development on outcomes on kids, is that they're using all kids together, but they're forgetting that you need to control for example, kids who went to private daycares. So when you adjust for that, there will probably be even more of an effect that goes in the direction of what I'm talking about. Uh, Quebec has been able to satisfy the rising demand not because of the program, but because markets work in spite of government intervention, which is incredibly telling.
Do you think that, so why wouldn't they have just expanded the number of spaces to meet the demand? I mean, it's because the way I would look at it, if I could argue this, is that in the K to 12 education system, we have choice, and parents would choose to put their child in a private school for a variety of reasons. It's not, gosh, I can't get my child in a public school, therefore I have to pay out of pocket. And I'm wondering if there's a dynamic there. Are people choosing that they would want to have a private daycare option, or is it they have no choice, they need childcare, and they're paying out of pocket? It seems like that would be an easy policy solution, to just expand the number of spaces. What am I missing?
I would say that there's two things. One of the reasons why the private daycares are also growing in terms of numbers, Quebec has been having a really good time relative to other provinces in Canada. Quebec has been for the last 15 years, actually people keep forgetting this, but has been the fiscal discipline champion of Canadian provinces. Quebec has had one of the fastest rates of economic growth, especially when you compare it to, well, not the fastest, but very fast. So it's been converging with the rest of Canada since the early 1990s, and it's been catching up, and most of the gap is now closed. Well, that says that Quebec is growing more productive, and by growing more productive, wages are going up, and more people can afford the cost of daycare. Now, the thing is that means that in the ration system, where it's the public system that can't offer more space because it has to be paid by raising essentially taxes, the space is going to be limited. But the richer parents can now afford the private childcare system. So the reason why it works is that not that the program works, it's that Quebec is doing so much better on other margins that these mechanisms can be developed and employed. So that's how I put it. And the reason why the government doesn't want to increase the number of spots is that by being subsidized like to a high degree, they'd be the ones raising their costs massively. And the fact that they don't, by the way, pretty much to me confirms that there is no extra revenues. Because if it was that much of a cheap shot, they would actually just offer the subsidized places and it would generate enough revenues to pay for itself. The fact that they're not doing it is pretty much a confirmation that that's not a self-paying program.
Okay, now you've got all of my Albertans upset, seeing that the gap is closed with Quebec, but Quebec continues to get large equalization transfers, as well as this additional tranche of money that's coming in for the daycare program. But I'll talk to another academic about that one. That's going to be a follow-up conversation. But maybe I should ask you another aspect of this, which is there value in just being able to free up more personal income in the hands of the family? I'm trying to understand if there is another economic value that I'm not considering. Because you'd mentioned how sensitive women are to income tax reductions. If you're going to help to defray call it 50% of the cost of daycare, that puts more money in the hands of individuals, which would have a stimulating effect to the economy. You should be able to track that there's some benefit of that. Is there an argument to be made there?
Yes. So first of all, the effect of tax cuts on economic growth is not that big. It's not negative, but it's not the most gigantic. Largely because Canada's not that much of a high tax district. It's not like a low tax district. Let's get this right. But a small reduction would not have a big impact. Deregulation is probably the kind of stuff that would generate more growth. But deregulations on, like, say, stuff that isn't related to daycare. So we're moving a bit far behind. So say allowing more competition in the Canadian economy, because of some of my other work with the Fraser Institute, allowing foreign firms to enter the Canadian market more easily, to increase competition, say, for cell phone services, for airline services, would reduce the cost of living enough that people would actually get more personal income. And by grinding more personal income, that basically means that they're more productive. By being more productive, that means that they can actually afford daycare more easily now. So that would be one way, again, a roundabout way to get to your result, is you want people to be so much rich that daycare is an easy thing to afford. It's an even like an afterthought, like buying bread at the grocery store. Well, one way to do so is to keep increasing productivity. Now, that's a really roundabout way. It's not going to create like a tomorrow solution, but it's not going to hurt. It's going to help. So that's probably one of the ways I would tie in some of my other work. Now, obviously, anything that actually increases the personal income of people so they can make more choices, they have access to more choices than before, is something you'd want to have.
But is there some loss that you have by taxing the money away and then rebating it back through a system like we're
Oh,
talking about with the daycare? I'm trying to figure out. I really am trying to find all of the benefits that we can out of the Quebec approach, since it seems to be the one that's going to be the standard across the country.
Uh, I don't see much. The idea the idea that we tax people and then redistribute it, and that this has no cost. A bureaucracy has cost. The taxation itself changes the incentives of political players. And the reality is that in Quebec we've seen that largely by the constant battle between the daycare unions and the provincial governments, and the fact that there's always strikes that happen throughout the network. And when they do so, there's
Mhm.
a massive discontent for people saying, why are we blocked service? This is somewhat makes people somewhat uneasy. So I don't see any benefit, to be honest. It's the kind of well-intended policy. I get where some people are coming from, but they're not seeing that it's the outcome are not what has been described. It's not that beneficial. The benefits are very, very much smaller than what's being advertised. The costs are much greater than what's being advertised, and you could get these benefits that we've mentioned at a much cheaper way by these roundabout mechanisms that I've discussed. And it would be
So
even better if it was provincialized, not federalized. Any form of federal program. I just mean, you're from Alberta, I'm from
yeah.
Quebec. You and I have massively different environment in which we evolve. Even just culturally speaking, just the French difference is a big deal. You can't have a one size fits all policy that's federal and then goes down to the provinces. At the very least, the provinces should be allowed to try their own different sets of policies and compete with one another. That would be much better than what's being discussed.
One other aspect I wanted to talk to you about. So the $5 a day daycare, what that didn't stay in place. It's moved up
No,
now, right? Is
no.
it
So
$10? Or tell us the evolution of the payment system there.
it went to $7 in 2004, I want to say. I'm not forgetting exactly when. Now there's a modulated fee. Don't ask me the formula. I've completely it slips out of my mind every time. But now it's a formula for your daily fees for the subsidized one that go according to your income. So we've gone back to what we
Hmm.
basically had before, but with more hurdles in the way, because before what Quebec had was an income modulated system with tax credits that had some flaws that are very technical, and I don't want to get into it. It was largely to do with the frequency of payment and the cash constraint that people had on a daily basis. That was basically the argument for it back in the 90s. But today we're back to this. We have an income modulated fee, but within the public's the subsidized sector. So is it why do we bother having like the the government produced one rather than just letting it into the market and doing an income targeted transfer? So Quebec is actually like start from like the ideal universal program that they had at the beginning and how they've tinkered with it so much that it doesn't look like anything
Hmm.
universal anymore. So it's even Quebec has admitted by default that was not this was not a good set of policy. It's been abandoned in everything but name.
Which makes sense. I can understand from a political point of view that if you've not been able to offer spaces to everyone, and then you have a subsidized sector and a non-subsidized sector, you'd kind of have to look at who got access to those spaces in the subsidized sector. And if it turned out to be more high-income individuals, that becomes a really difficult political sell because then it looks like you're transferring money from those who are lower and middle income to those who are higher income. I'm just positing that as a hypothesis. Did that actually occur? Was it the case that those who are higher income had an easier time accessing those
So
subsidized spaces?
so before the modulated fee, the one that have started, I think 2012, 2014. Don't quote me on the dates. I'm forgetting. The timeline is a bit blurry for when they made the changes in fee structures. But when it was the $5 and $7 a day, uh, when that was the case, there was a paper by a fiscalist from the University of Quebec in Montreal who actually checked according to your income class if you gained or lost from relative to the previous regime where you had a form of targeted income tax credit. What he found is obviously very low income households did gain, very rich income households gain.
Hmm.
The people in the middle, from say, these were from numbers based on 1997, so the numbers are going to be much lower, but people who were between 20,000. So the average GDP per capita in the 1990s in Quebec was in the 20,000s, right? So today it's much higher, but like it's just the numbers, right? So we just like try to just imagine proportion. The 60 people that would constitute like the middle class, they were actually on net. They lost financially from the program. They were better off with the previous system
Hmm.
than they were with the new one. But the rich, the very rich, so people in the top 10% up roughly, they actually gained. They actually had substantial financial gains from this. And only the very poorest, which you do care about, did gain, but their gains were, I would say, trivial proportionally to those of the very rich, because previously the tax rates for the very rich were relatively low. For the poor, they were relatively high. Now the subsidy was so big that for the poor, losing the tax credit was not a net loss, but it wasn't a big gain. For the rich, you were losing something small and you gained something pretty big.
Hmm.
So the effect was very uneven. So that was one of the big criticisms at first, and which is why eventually they brought back some tax credits so that people using the private system would use it to some degree more, so that the wait list would stop. They also brought in the modulated fees, and essentially all of these amount to kind of a capitulation on the statement that this is a great program. No, it's not.
Hmm.
It's been a disappointment. A failure would be too strong. Failure is like has like an utter sense of objection to it, while a disappointment is more accurate. Uh, it didn't live up to its promise. And you could have got what you wanted so much cheap, so much better in different ways. So eh.
Well, this is why it becomes an interesting challenge because I'm wondering if the federal guidance on this is based on how the program originally was and how it was envisioned versus what it has ultimately become. So
Oh,
it helps to give us some kind of guidance about what other provinces should be considering. Let me just ask you about now this modulated fee that you're talking about. Does it ultimately phase out? I mean, do you get to a high enough income where you don't get any subsidy at all, or is there always some portion of the cost of childcare that is paid for in the subsidized daycare setting,
I don't
regardless
know.
of your income?
It
Hmm.
doesn't fade out to zero, right? So it's
Okay.
not as if like people like say $150,000 a day get to like pay the market price, right? They always get some subsidies, but I think I forget. Like I don't quote me on the numbers, but past a certain relatively high threshold, you're getting a subsidy, but it's a pretty trivial one. And I would be surprised how much rich parents are using use the subsidized system in that case, given the wait list. Because now the subsidy is so much smaller now that you're like, what's the difference between say the going market rate of $50 a day or $45 a day relative to say 15 or something like this?
Well, that makes some sense then. So that could also explain why we've seen the increase then on the private side, is if there isn't the advantage to get into a subsidized space because you're paying close to market rates anyway, then you may as well avoid the hassle of trying to do the wait. How significant are the wait lists? Maybe I should try to understand that too.
I haven't updated the numbers since 2017, so I haven't caught up with the wait list, largely because I've been focused on how many mothers went back to work, which is what I'm putting the most attention to right now in terms of research. But also the importance, and this is maybe like a good spot for me to conclude on, like kind of as a way to invite myself in the future. Since I also care a lot about the area that the Fraser does with economic freedom, and by the way, I have a chapter in the next edition of the Economic Freedom of the World Index for those who are interested. Like I'm just literally just plugging my own work. But some of the work I'm doing with Diana Thomas in daycare, which I've mentioned when she's the one that did the work on regulation, we're trying to see right now what's the effect of economic freedom on women's, or more precisely, mothers' labor market participation, their earnings, the wage gap, conditional on government regulations of childcare. So how much childcare are inhibiting or minimizing in a certain way the benefits of economic freedom to women's outcomes. So that's the work we're doing now. And this is where I think people, and the reason why I'm trying to conclude with this is that people underestimate the importance of market in promoting better outcomes, because in a competitive market, the virtue that you have is continual feedback loops. Bureaucratic processes don't have this. And by having this feedback loop, you can adjust the service, you can adjust the quantity, you can adjust the margin, you can increase the way it's being provided. People can explore new ways. They can mix different arrangements, because you had that before. You had part-time daycares and people who were using grandparents as substitutes to this because they cared about a mixed family environment. These are options that people would explore more in a competitive environment than something else, and they would explore those that are most fitted to them, which is why you would say that environments that are less regulated, that offer the greatest set of options to workers to try and experiment, to play, and you give them the most resources to experiment with, rather than having this is how you're going to consume it, you're more likely to have the outcomes you want. So those that are beneficial to kids' development, but also to the development of mothers who are not scarred by their too long away sojourn from the market. You can get all these benefits in very roundabout ways, but in a way that much more sustainable, cheaper, and more effective. That's the way I'd put it.
It's going to be very well timed, because we're going to be plunged into this discussion about the best way to deliver childcare and support women over the next year. So thank you so much for the work that you do. Thank you for the conversation today. That was Vincent Geloso. He is a professor of economics at George Mason University, as well as a senior fellow of the Fraser Institute. Thanks for being with us.
It was a pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe on YouTube and wherever you stream your podcasts. And to stream old episodes, learn more about the show, and where to subscribe and submit your questions for future guests, visit fraserforum.org.